that I think that there are books that they tap into a sort of public consciousness of stuff going on in the real world, and they kind of like seize the moment. It's really I said, what's his name? The guy that wrote The Tipping Point, Malcolm Gladbury or whatever his name is. But anyway, The Tipping Point.
Is it Gladwell?
Yeah, I think that's it. But The Tipping Point, I think, really explains that dynamic of, why the hula hoop? Why suede shoes? He examines a number of things like that. And part of it is that you just have to get a group of gatekeepers and opinion makers and everything all sort of have to coalesce over something. And then there's this kind of weight that builds up. And at some point it becomes so dense, so heavy, that it tips over and it pulls this enormous mass with it. But you can't really, it's almost impossible to make it happen.
Or to see it.
You can't really design for it.
I don't think so.
And that's why I'm saying if Dan had published that book today, we've moved on. We have a pope. There's a lot of things that have changed, and I don't think the book would have anywhere near the same impact.
Probably not. Yes, probably not. Well, it's sort of like the crime novel itself. I think a lot of interest, especially in the procedures of how crimes are taken care of. There's so much with CSI. There's so much interest in DNA. There's so much out there that people are interested in, that they want to feel like they know part of it, and they think that they do know part of it. And if you get any of it wrong, they know that you've gotten it wrong. But it's sort of a fascination with putting all of those pieces together and being a part of being able to solve it. And it's sort of the same way that mysteries have been doing it for forever, but with the thriller, they just kind of ratchet up a little bit with, being terrorists instead, or being a more of a threat or more of an urgency than just being able to figure out who killed Grandma, in the living room.
Well, it tends to be of a larger scale, a more national or global
or
sort
more
of scale.
urgent.
More urgent,
yes.
And it also tends to be more of a duel than it is a puzzle cracking kind of exercise. Oftentimes in a thriller, you know who the adversary is, whereas in a traditional crime novel, you don't. The exercise of the book, in fact, is to figure out who is the adversary, and you only learn that at the end, where very often in a thriller, you know it from the beginning, and so it's a whole different. It's not who is it, but
the thrill is getting being in on the chase.
Yeah, it's who's going to win rather than than who did it. But it comes back to my original point with you that I think A Perfect Evil probably tapped into a certain residual left over from Silence of the Lambs and a certain heightened awareness of serial killers. Because today, there are frankly very few serial killer novels. That whole thing is in genre fiction tends to go in waves anyhow.
Well, and it's interesting, too, because when we were first trying to sell A Perfect Evil, a lot of the first rejections said, no, the serial killer novel is sort of finished. Everybody is sick of serial killer novels, because it was after Silence of the Lambs several years, and there must have been just a slew of them.
There were. Yes. Absolutely. And then what happens is you not only get good ones, but you get a lot of bad ones. And people get tired of it. They get tired of the wait. They get tired of the poorly executed, and they're ready to move on to something, fresh. But there still is a thread of, if there's a really good one, as yours was, it will still survive.
Well, talking about tapping into, like Dan Brown, tapping into the Pope, Perfect Evil brought to attention the priest scandal, and this is 2000, and it wasn't until 2001 or 2002 that the Boston Globe sort of broke the lid off of that story and that scandal. But when A Perfect Evil first came out, I remember getting people saying, oh, this is just a little bit too far-fetched, that a priest could possibly be a suspect and this stuff doesn't go on, and et cetera, et cetera. Had I written that maybe a couple years later, it could have really have taken off.
Well, that's very true. That's an icon that was difficult for many people to give up.
Well, it was different writing A Necessary Evil, because there was sort of this credibility with The Necessary Evil, because by then people did know that it could and did happen. So it was very different from one to the other.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. And a lot of it is what happened in society, not so much what happened in your book.
Yes, exactly.
Well, tell me about One False Move, because along with the 5 Maggie Odells, before we got to Whitewash, you did write a different standalone.
Well, in One False Move, I actually started, and I had to put it away. I was writing out at a cabin that I used to go to all the time, and it's about 30 miles outside of Lincoln, Nebraska, about 40 miles outside of Omaha. And when I was there in the middle of the week, there wasn't anybody in the 13 cabins that surround the lake. And all of a sudden, I started hearing this helicopter over the lake. And it was flying so low that I could see police on the side of it. And it was a police helicopter. So I went back inside, turned on my portable TV, and there had been a bank robbery in Lincoln, 30 miles away. The robbers had gotten away. They had shot a farm couple and stolen the pickup, and I was in the middle of the manhunt. The park was in the middle of the manhunt. In fact, by the time that I threw the dogs in the car and got myself in the car, I had to go through a police blockade on one side of the park, and they told me there was another one on the other side. So I was literally in the middle of that manhunt. So I went home and I started writing notes, tons of notes, because I had the best idea for a novel. Only in mine, the 3 bank robbers get away with no money, and they leave 4 people dead in the bank. Put it aside, had to put it aside because I owed the publisher another Maggie Odell. And then about a year later, I started writing the book again. Was about a quarter of the way through, and 3 men walked into a Norfolk bank and ended up leaving with no money and 5 people dead. It was the second bloodiest, deadliest bank robbery in Nebraska's history. And it was, again, it was so surreal, because it sort of felt like they were copying what I had come up with, what I had done. But it was a different kind of thriller. It was a different kind of novel. It was sort of, I wanted to base it kind of like on Charlie Starkweather, where
Right.
these 3 people, in fact, one of my characters is named Charlie Starks, after
Right.
Charlie Starkweather. These 3 people end up robbing a bank, and everything goes horribly wrong. And then the rest is just sort of what comes of that, and what they're capable of doing, what they're capable of continuing to do just to get away. So it sort of came out of a real experience, a real fear, and just sort of I just let it go.
The fact that you were writing it to be a standalone, did that mean that you could put everybody into much more serious jeopardy than you
Yes.
can in a series book?
Absolutely.
Must
yes.
have been fun for you.
It was. It was really fun. And I even put an author in it who is out at Platte River State Park where I was, and the bank robbers end up coming into the cabin and taking him hostage. So I sort of inserted myself into the story. And it was a lot of fun to be able to do it. It was a lot of fun to be able to use Nebraska, because I don't think that those sort of things could happen just anywhere. But with
Right.
all of the openness of Nebraska, you can elude the law enforcement for at least several days. And it was a lot of fun to be able to use that as a backdrop.
I suppose the Starkweather case has left a big footprint in Nebraska that's almost impossible to avoid, isn't it?
It's amazing. When I went on the book tour this last fall, the book was chosen for Nebraska's One Book, One Read. And when I went on the tour this last fall, it was amazing how many people came up and told me Charlie Starkweather stories. You know,
Really?
They were kids, or they were working, or where they were.
When was the Starkweather? When did that whole thing happen?
I believe it was, I want to say it was 56 or 58. It was.
I think I was in high school at the time. I graduated in 58, so...
It's amazing how many people
Yeah.
still remember. But
I
the
thought
other...
it might be later, though, for some
No, it
reason.
was because it was sort of that James Dean sort of. He kind of dressed like James Dean, and kind of. I can't remember what kind of car they drove, but it was. I believe it was 56 or 58, and I can't remember which.
There was a very good novel somebody wrote about the Starkweather case a year or two ago. I'm going completely blank on who she is, but it was...
Liza Ward,
that's
Outside
it.
of Valentine. Yes, I've been on a couple of panels with Liza, and I don't know if I'll get this right, but I think it was her grandparents who were killed by
Something
Charlie
like that.
Starkweather.
There was an actual connection.
Yes, a family connection. And she grew up knowing that they had died, but she didn't know the circumstances until she was like a teenager.
Okay.
It's something like that, and I can't remember if it's grandparents or great-grandparents, because she's fairly young. It must be grandparents. It'd have to be
I
grandparents if
think it
happened in
might be. I mean, it was an
50s.
interesting book.